All right, welcome back. We're here for the 12:15 virtual session. We have Ashwin Krishnan here. He's the COO at Uber Knowledge, and he's here to talk about trust and privacy in IoT. My question is there such a thing? And I'm looking forward to seeing how you address it and how you answer it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So before I start, the whole concept of privacy and trust in IoT, especially as it develops, is something that is, I would consider to be existential. And we'll see as we move along why I believe that. But the topic that I'm going to be talking about is how do we move from IoT to IoTT, which is how do you enable trust in IoT. So let's start with examples. I mean, there is no point talking about theory unless we talk about what's happening in real life. So many of you might have remember this incident where the Nest, which is part of Google, introduced a microphone and people were caught unawares, right? So think about that, talking about one of the most marquee brands and something that's getting increasingly popular, which is Nest. In this case, it was the Nest Guard. Another one, and this is a little bit less reported, but equally impactful. I'm sure many of you travel internationally, even domestically these days, you have in-seat entertainment systems. And this one was on Singapore Airlines, and one of the passengers, who happens to be a journalist as well, noticed a small camera, what looked like a camera, on the display. And he actually tweets to Singapore Airlines saying, hey, I'm traveling, is that a camera? And to be fair to Singapore Airlines, they did reply back saying, yes, this is a camera, but don't worry about it because it's disabled. The software is disabled, right? So, and we know how software updates can enable that. But the third one, and this is a little bit more spooky for anybody who uses Airbnb. If you're an Airbnb guest and the camera was turned on in the home that you're actually renting, would that spook you out? But let's get personal here. This is me, and I like to wear sunglasses. I'm going to wear one right now for the benefit of the audience. Looks like a nice sunglass, right? Something different about it, like I point on the screen over there. This is a camera. These are actually microphones, and it has a USB, it has a SD card slot. And it's $40, and it's advertised as Spy HD. Now, I guarantee you that you're probably going to have 5G and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and Zigbee and so on and so forth. So the point is, we're getting to a place where IoT is prevalent everywhere. And the topic of privacy, trust, and ethics, as I'll get into, is not just for somebody else. It's for you and me and everybody around us. So, but first, before we get into that, why is this happening? I mean, what are some of the collection of events that have led us to a place right now where this is becoming center stage? And I contend there are really 4 driving forces, and we'll go through each one in detail. The first one is technology. The second one is regulation. The third is ethics, and the fourth is competition. So let's start with technology. So what's happening in the technology world today that is driving this behavior? Storage, compute, and software. I'm sure you've heard the word FOMO, fear of missing out. So the cost of storage is plummeting downwards. How many of you remember when you really had to worry about how much memory your phone had when you took videos or photographs? I'm sure many of you don't even worry about it anymore. Why? Because you have Google Photos, you have Apple iTunes, and things magically go into the cloud. So the ubiquity, the cost, and at least specifically for IoT, the FOMO aspect is so huge, which means I'm actually going to instrument everything, collect data that I have no idea whether I need it or not, because if I don't, what happens? So think of the Singapore Airlines example. The reason Panasonic Aviation, which is the market leader for in-screen entertainment systems, threw in that camera is because some airline at some point is going to wake up and say, hey, we need to monitor our passengers. Who's sleeping, what they like, what they drink, so on and so forth. So therefore, camera is essential. So they actually threw in that camera, even though the software wasn't ready. So this kind of widespread deployment of sensors is really the ability for for manufacturers to potentially mine that data in the future. And because storage is so cheap, they can do it for a fraction of what it was even a year ago. Compute, very, very similar. Cost is plummeting. Whether it's edge computing, whether it's cloud computing, doesn't matter, ubiquity. And then the location. You can actually have compute at the point of data collection, or you can have compute at the cloud or anywhere in between, right? So storage and cost. And the third one is software. This is another really, really important point, which is lots of industries are getting into IoT and ML and AI for the first time. Mining, agriculture, and therefore, they don't have the software expertise that maybe a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter or a Uber has. But because of lots of available pre-trained algorithms that are out there today, they can actually get a jump start. So compute, storage, and software. Moving on, regulations. So GDPR has been widely reported, General Data Protection Regulation, and it's been over a year since it went into effect, but it's driven behavior changes, both positive and negative. For instance, there are organizations that believe GDPR is for everybody, and they treat every customer as an EU customer or EU citizen, and therefore they have raised the bar. The others have taken a different approach, which is let's pretend it doesn't exist and let the first fine get levied, 4% or 20 million euros, and we will then go forward. US states, I mean, I'm from California, and probably it's leading the country, at least the US, when it comes to regulations, and there's a sweeping act called California Consumer Privacy Act, or the CCPA. Pertinent to this group over here is the IoT 327, which is also very impactful. It talks about how default passwords for IoT selling into California needs to be different for each device. And Illinois has a biometrics act as well. So the point is there is a lot of activism that's going on when it comes to regulations, not just at a national level, but also at a state level. And then it's not enough to just have regulations, but the impact of those regulations need to be felt by the consumers. So the awareness. And lots of you, even if you don't remember GDPR, the phrase, the right to be forgotten, is something that many, many of you have heard. And the right to be forgotten is something that sticks in your head because we are giving up a lot of data. And if I can tell a provider saying, hey, I need to be forgotten now. So that awareness is starting to rise. So everybody is starting to ask questions about, okay, how do I be asked to be forgotten? And the other piece is portability, right? And whether it's the Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, whether it's Microsoft, a lot of these large players have realized that both consumers and regulations are coming at them. And there's been talks about breaking up some of these large tech behemoths. So they're starting to get into the act of realizing they have to stop pretending to be a monopoly, right? And they are a monopoly, we all know that, but they have to realize that they need to do something above and beyond, otherwise they're going to be in trouble. So the whole concept of data portability, about how do you take your data, for instance, from Facebook and move it over to a different social network, and likewise with LinkedIn and so forth. So we've talked about technology, we've talked about regulations. So let's talk about ethics. And it's surprising, I'm probably pretty sure this is the first time the word ethics has been used in this conference, or any of the other 9 or 10 conferences I've talked about this year. And the reason is it's a touchy-feely thing. There isn't a regulation on ethics. But let's try to make it more clear. The first one is awareness, right? So Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, for the first time raised awareness. Is it okay for Facebook to take your data and give it to a third party like Cambridge Analytica to do whatever data brokering they want? Or are they obligated to let the end user know in no uncertain terms that they are doing that, right? So the awareness piece. Nest microphone, same thing, which is Google's response was, yeah, we had that introduced and mea culpa. So imagine a manufacturer introduces a piece of sensor and the user is not aware of it, and you have this thing called Nest Guard at home, and it's listening to your conversations at home. And then SQ is Singapore Airlines, and I gave you that example earlier about how an in-seat display with a camera, and it took a journalist to call that out, and Singapore Airlines' response was, hey, guess what? The software is disabled, so don't worry about it. Initiatives, openbook.org, it's now called Open Space. I'm actually a brand ambassador for Open Space, and I love the fact that it is everything that Facebook should be but is not. For example, Open Space is about everything is open source, it's privacy by design, it is opt-in, and you can look at their manifesto, and it spells about who they are and what they bring to the table. And it is a nonprofit, and it's a collection of people who've realized that there are lots and lots of benefits to what Facebook brings to the table in terms of what it's set out to be. But because of the obfuscation, because of the ad-based approach, they have gotten way off course. And OpenBook is another initiative, or open space right now, to help bring back some of the goodness that Facebook once had without the obfuscation. Boundless Mind is another great startup based in Southern California, and their viewpoint is, any of you have smartphones or tablets or laptops, when you have the red dot go off in one of the tabs, and you say, oh no, what? I'm missing something. I need to go back and see who notified me something on LinkedIn. What am I missing? So a lot of this is based on psychoanalysis about how the mind works, right? And a lot of these so-called addictive apps are built in such a way that they force us to stay on. Remember the YouTube, hey, waiting for the next video so you don't go off YouTube and go on to Facebook. So Boundless Mind doesn't try to fight that, but what they're doing is creating that same experience for just causes. Medical, social health, and so on and so forth, right? So those are some really interesting initiatives. And then the technology side, the term AI explainability is becoming rampant. Why? Because now you have algorithms making decisions, but then if a Tesla goes off course and hits somebody, who is, and it's an autopilot, who has to answer, right? So how do you explain what an algorithm did and what it chose to do? And that needs to be forefront. So we've talked a lot about over these last couple of days about AI and machine learning, which is great, except the people who are deploying it need to understand that they need to be able to answer why a particular prediction or a decision was made, even if it wasn't a human behind it, but an algorithm, which is how it's going to be going forward. And then this whole thing about data AI agent, I've had a few hallway conversations with folks, and I brought up the fact that we're all producers of data, and there are lots of collectors out there who are collecting the data. But the challenge is the asymmetry of information. And there are supercomputers aimed at our head which know exactly how we are operating, what we will be doing in the future, but there isn't anybody who is working on our behalf. So what ends up happening is we don't know, we pretend to be unaware of what's going on, and then we feel violated when something comes out. So the data AI agent, if you Google it, it's this whole concept of an agent that's working on your behalf, an agent that actually starts to broker on your behalf. So it's almost like not completely leveling the playing field, but making it one step closer to that. So that's ethics. Competition. So there is a lot of skills shortage in a variety of fields, cybersecurity being one, data analytics being another. So if you are any company worth your salt, you have to have some way to attract talent. And the ability to have things like AI and data analytics and machine learning in your portfolio does make it more attractive. Now, what that means is you're also forced to get into understanding what the technology does at a deeper level to be able to make yourself a sellable component for talent. The second one is self-regulation, and this is an interesting one because if you hear Mark Zuckerberg and other Facebook executives right now, or even Google for that matter, they are talking about, hey, we're going to self-regulate ourselves, right? And you can take that with a pinch of salt, but why that's happening is because they don't want to be left behind. For example, if Satya Nadella at Microsoft starts to show up, or Tim Cook rather, more specifically, has been doing much more vocally about being a custodian of Apple customers, right? So he's the protector of your data, and therefore the competition needs to now quickly size up as to whether the consumer mindset is shifting and people are becoming more gravitating towards Apple because of the way Tim Cook is portraying Apple. Now, the fear of missing out of whether it's positive or negative is so high. So therefore, a lot of this competition is also based on who's doing what, who's the first mover, and how do I catch up as quickly as possible because I'm going to be left behind. And then the last piece is the employee activism piece. And we've seen this with both Google and Microsoft, where their employees are starting to stand up, whether it's Project Maven, which is Google, or another large deal that Microsoft was involved in, where the employees stood up and said no to that, right? So the competition is working in very, very different ways, but these are the kind of the four things that are really compelling the way a business behaves. But what does a business do? And this is where I introduce the AEIOU framework, or the vowel framework. So it is A for armor, E for envelope, I for intention, O for option, and U for ubiquity. And we'll go through that in detail. So A, what is A? Is the software being developed securely? If you're developing the software, do you have best practices? If you're sourcing the software from outside, do you know the source of that? So the software itself, integrity. And this is important. And for lots of industries that are going into IoT for the first time, this is not a one and done thing. You are going to have issues, whether it's patches, whether it's software upgrades, whether it's CVEs. How do you upgrade it? Is the device physically hardened? And which means, can it be hacked in remotely? And lots of these devices are in locations which cannot be reached by humans. Think of a nuclear rig, a power plant, etc. And the last piece is, I gave you an example earlier of the California IoT 327, an example of how simple things can make it more robust. Default password is different for each device, and it has to be mandatorily changed the first time it boots up. Second, E, envelope. So what is envelope? Think of this as obfuscation. Sensors collecting data. What is happening to the data? Is it being protected on the device? Second question, is it being protected in transit? We talked about edge computing and cloud computing, and computing could be anywhere. So is the storage. So as the data is moving from location 1 to location 2, is it being protected? The third one, and this is an interesting one, because lots of times you think about IoT and you think, oh, it's all at the edge. No, it's in the cloud. So once the data is moved to the cloud, predictions are being made. Is that being stored? And is it being stored and protected? And the last one, which I think people don't even think about, is, remember what I talked about earlier, because the cost of storage has gone down so dramatically, I'm going to store forever. No, you're going to expose yourself forever. So how is data being disposed of consistently and periodically? Intention. This is an important one, right? Everybody can talk about, oh, I'm conforming to the letter of the law. I'm letting my customer know. You're not letting your customer know. You're letting your lawyers know that you're covering your ass. Pardon my French. You're not letting the customer know. I'll give you an example of what it means by letting the customer know. This is what Lufthansa's website looks like when you log in there, when you go to the website for the first time. And I was stunned by looking at this. For the first time in my life, I mean, I've been a tech head, but this is what they define as cookies that the end user can understand. So you opt into statistics, comfort, or personalization. This is not adhering to a regulatory framework just to make sure that you're not getting sued. This is to make sure the end user, the average end user, understands that, hey, you can choose statistics, but you won't be given the option of next time you come to Lufthansa, we won't automatically know that your preferred language is Deutsch and not French. If you want that, choose personalization. So again, this is what I mean by intentionality. Can the average customer understand? The second is, why is the data being collected? I remember the activism I talked about earlier. People are going to, or your consumers are going to start asking this question, so better get prepared. And then, think Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. Always think that, because it's going to remind you as to, are you going and sourcing data brokers to collect data? Are you giving up the data that you've collected to third parties? And then, is any of these, so any of the intention that you're saying, going and changing some of the answers to the previous questions, right? Should I be developing the software more securely? Am I protecting the data in transit or at the point? So all of these things will help you. If you're not able to explain in layman's terms of what is it you're trying to do, you'd better go back and change what you're doing. Optionality. Again, think of the Lufthansa example I mentioned earlier. Are you giving the customer options? So what they can and cannot do. And again, this is the same example of, I can choose personalization. At that point, I'm getting, quote unquote, a more personalized user experience through Lufthansa, or I can choose statistics, in which case there is complete anonymization. Not complete, but there is better anonymization than with personalization. Like we talked about earlier, technology is allowing and competition is driving the fact that you can move from platform A to platform B, but are you making that visible to the end user? Are you making him or her aware of the fact that you can take your Facebook data and go to open space and start off with a brand new, non-ad-based social network? And then this is going back to what I mentioned earlier about the data AI agent. So this is a great book that starts talking about the whole concept of how you and I, as end users, can start trading in our data in exchange for compensation. The last piece is ubiquity, which is, it's not a one and done thing. Everything that you do, is it being uniformly applied across every single product or service that you sell? And this is a cultural shift, because way too often there is a sudden wake-up moment, because think of competition, right? Your competitor just got brought into court, and he or she got a big penalty, and suddenly everybody's agog. 6 months later, you're back down to the basics, right? So the ubiquitous nature is really about making it pervasive. The second aspect is this being applied across all customer demographics? Let me give you one example. Finning International, which is a Canadian-based heavy equipment rental firm, and they are the largest distributor of Caterpillar. So Susie Smibert, who is the CISO of Finning, so she had this wonderful article where she was talking about how she is trying to change the culture inside of Finning. But the one thing that she did from a mind shift perspective is, every customer, as far as Finning goes, is an EU customer, which means GDPR for all. So she made GDPR kind of the baseline for every customer, and innovation on top of that, right? So again, there are different ways to attack this, but the point is, I'm going to only satisfy EU and give them a certain set of rights, but then the rest of the countries, yeah, you can go pound sand because you don't have any regulation, right? That's one way of looking at it. The other way is, okay, these principles are enduring principles, and therefore it's essentially a digital human right, and therefore needs to be made available across all demographics. So I talked about this earlier, right? Which is, I have a wake-up moment, and therefore I'm going to stand up there and do this one-time thing. No, it's not a one-time thing. It has to be consistent, continuous, in order for it to actually take root. And this is also another important piece, which is the world is changing. The regulatory environment is changing. We talked about GDPR. GDPR is also evolving. We've talked about CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. We talked about the Illinois Fingerprint Act. So the point being that you need to keep up with the changing regulatory environment, but also the changing competitive environment, right? So it's not okay to say, okay, so I've cast this in stone and therefore this is good enough for the foreseeable future. No, it's not. If the Google Nest thing happened now, and if you're in the sensor business of collecting information, what are you doing to understand what sorts of sensors do you already have and do the end users know about it? So that, in a nutshell, is the framework we talked about, right? And again, personally for me, I've had a challenge keeping up with these frameworks because they are pretty dry. And you could sit in a class and you could learn about it, but you walk away 3 months later, you're scratching your head saying, hey, what was that? So I came up with this vowel framework because it's something that I think, at least for me, is enduring. You can't forget vowels. If you do, you have bigger problems than IoT security. But again, so A is for armor, E is for envelope, I is for intentionality, O is for optionality, and U is for ubiquity. The one thing I will say is this is what ultimately ends up being a trusted business. You could have a business, you could have a successful business, but if you really want to be a trusted, trustworthy partner, you need to think about these principles in a framework that is comprehensible, actionable, and continuous. And if you do that, I can pretty much guarantee you will go from IoT to IoTT. So I think I'm just about out of time over here. So I thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. OK. So with that being said, again, thank you for your time. I'm sure the next session is going to start shortly. Thank you, everybody.